The Radical Secular Podcast, a demand for justice, equality, and rational public policy. Subscribe at YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and all the major podcast channels. Visit our website at theradicalsecular.com for articles, insights, and our complete library of episodes. Support us on Patreon, and follow us on social media.
Hello, and welcome back to the Radical Secular Podcast. I'm Joe Kipinti.
I'm Christoph Defoe.
I'm Sean Prophet.
Body self-determination is a central theme in human liberation. In this episode, we will be exploring how the body has been a major center of power and control across recent history. The body has been a contested political space since the dawn of civilization, but the shape and form of that struggle has changed. To truly understand the politics of the body in our times, it's worthwhile to engage with what Michel Foucault called the biopolitics of our age. We will use this opportunity to delve into political intellectual history, as well as the issues of our day, and the ones that best resonate with this politic: abortion rights, LGBTQ+ rights, and so on. Lastly, we will discuss how all of this relates to the rising right-wing agenda that resonates with the pre-modern past, and how we can create a new kind of politics, one of progress and resistance in this post-liberal world. Before we get to that, I want to remind you that if you like our show, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, check out our Patreon, and tell your friends to listen. New episodes post Mondays at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. We publish new articles regularly in our journal as well at theradicalsecular.com.
The Radical Secular Podcast is brought to you by Cannibal & Co., located in downtown Jersey City and at shopcannibal.com. Cannibal, that's Cannibal with a K, stocks a rotating collection of goods ranging from apparel and accessories to home furnishings and fine jewelry. Cannibal weaves together its forward-thinking vision with its traditional roots to provide an expertly curated experience of unique and locally sourced finds. We're grateful to Cannibal for sponsoring our show.
Okay, let's do the t-shirt thing. Sean, what do you got sporting there?
Well, I'm wearing my Give Nazis a Platform shirt. And the reason I'm wearing this today is because we're going to pick on Nazis. And I think that it's very important that if you're a liberal, if you're modern, and that you've taken that lesson from the 20th century and the atrocities that happened with the Nazis, if you can't sit there without quibbling with a straight face and say that, you know, we should curtail and, do whatever we can to put a stop to Nazis, then you've got a problem. And that's one thing that when people start getting into this post-truth, postmodernist idea that all attitudes and philosophies are equal and deserve a platform, well, the guillotine is the platform that Nazis deserve. So,
yeah, we're definitely going to get into that today. Christoph, what about you, man?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, Sean. I'm glad that you brought that up. And, there's so much of this. I had conversations on social media with people like about this, right? But this idea that, everyone's opinion is somehow equal. And one of the things that I saw on social media recently, I think actually Jillian posted it, and that was the paradox of tolerance. Exactly. Yeah. And that sort of speaks to what you're talking about there. So today I'm wearing my, sort of intersectionality, transgender, LGBTQ, power shirt.
Very nice.
Yeah, that rocks.
Yeah, and it's, to your point that you were mentioning there, Joe, it's this body and bodily control is such a part of this fight. It is fundamentally what this fight is about, from the problems with capitalism to literal slavery to colonization to abortion. To patriarchy, etc. That is at the core of it, right? And so I don't have I think if I had an anti-abortion shirt or an abortion shirt, I would have worn that. I need to maybe get one of those. But this was the closest I could get to that idea. So, great topic. Looking forward to the show.
Great. So, because we're going to be talking about sort of postmodern thought and how it permeates our culture today, I wanted to wear something to balance that out. So I got my science shirt on. right? Because science. Because what we need to really do is ground ourselves in the modern project and in science, even if we are willing to open ourselves to other forms of thought and modes of thought, like postmodernism, which, you know, there are some good things to talk about postmodernism, but there's also a lot of bad. And we're going to get to all of that. So that's my t-shirt's keeping me grounded. That's what it's for.
Always a winner.
Like it.
Science.
Totally.
Right. So anyway, guys, depending how you define it, the number of Americans born intersex may be as high as 2%. And I'm going to start with that. How many of those babies have had their genitals surgically removed and altered because they were born that way? Despite all of our progress, this is still a very common practice. Only in recent years has it been challenged by the medical establishment as being unethical in some quarters. We don't think it's okay to sexually mutilate children otherwise, do we? And so why do we accept this as a standard practice? In short, it's the power of norms. But to really answer that question, we have to dig into our intellectual history. Many will say we live in a postmodern world. To make sense of that, we need to first understand what we mean by this thing called modernity. Modern institutions permeate our daily lives and affect how we live at all levels. They shape us in ways we are not even aware of, and they are being dismantled as we speak. What is it that we are losing and gaining from all this? Well, perhaps less baby genital mutilation is one plus. It's complicated. Modernism arose from the Enlightenment thinkers, those who came to believe that human nature could be improved and perfected through the humanist project, through progress via reason and science. The modernist project has always been an emancipatory project, whereby traditional values and institutions are to be replaced by liberal and rational ones. Corporal punishment, for example, was among one of the first things that modernity began to reject. Never mind, dismemberment. Inhumane stuff, right? Judging only by how we treat the intersex, this modernity has had mixed success. The modern liberal order radically redefined notions of the body, which did prove to be emancipatory. It provided many freedoms from the shackles of past hierarchies. We've talked about that so much in this show. And yet, it has also created new forms of oppression. We don't need to go as far as bodily mutilations to see it. Not everyone was on board with the modernist project, of course. We know that. There has been a powerful disillusionment of the modernist project as well. It extends beyond just the traditional resistance. And it has led to a multi-pronged assault on modernism. And it's been a bizarre mix of fundamentalist backlash and postmodernism. We have talked about fundamentalism many times in this show, right? I want to turn to the latter. Postmodernism is a reaction. That's the best way to understand it. It's a disenchantment to many aspects of modernity. Things like colonialism, the world wars, and really the general failure to achieve the goals that were set out by the Enlightenment. It has led to a loss in faith in human reason. The horrors of the interwar period, the Great Depression, the Holocaust, 100 million dead between the two world wars, that all shattered the modern project in the mid-20th century. And many came to reject and challenge modernity and its foundations. That is the basis of the postmodern movement. It started with architecture and the arts, the idea that such creative works derive their meaning from the observer and the users of those works. It has become a nihilistic response to modernism that has broadened into all corners of society, rejecting a lot more than just the art, right? It's about a rejection of reality itself. There are no objective truths, no fixed identities, and in some ways those notions are liberating. And it's gotten, for example, the medical establishment finally to accept the idea in the last few years that castrating baby penises and clitorises is a bad thing. But the feudal-like movements of the right today are also postmodern movements in many ways. The anti-science sentiment is also a postmodern sentiment. And so what gives? It's really very strange that we're facing this today, how it's all playing out. Don't you think, guys? I mean, modernity is under assault by, in so many ways. We got a lot to cover on this show, but let's start with that. Do you agree so far?
I do agree, and I think it's all really interesting. What jumped into my mind as I was hearing you speak, Joe, is just the extent of human ingenuity, right? Even in our reactiveness and our reaction to change and disillusionment. You mentioned disillusionment, right? In terms of not achieving the enlightenment goals, and our reaction is to just sort of swing to the other to the other side of the ledger. But it's more than that, right? It is coming up with a new and fantastic new way to oppress people, fantastic new ways to do what we want to do. And like we see this on the American right? And not just the American right, the right all over the place. Like we're not dealing with classic fascism, from 1940, but it's a new like neo-fascism, right? A new neo-reactiveness. And it's like I'm just struck by how remarkable human ingenuity is, but not only for good, usually and frequently not for good.
Yeah, and I think getting back to the body, I think that has been a contested shape and space for millennia. But the way it's being contested now, the way it's being used for political power now, is really 21st century, and it has a lot of similarities from the past, but it also has a lot of different forms. So yeah,
totally.
Absolutely. Very ingenious. You're right.
You remember, it's ingenious. You remember when we a while back, we watched we commented on that, on The Boys, that show, The Boys.
Yes.
And it was a fascinating critique of modern history. But what was interesting is that woman, the real bad guy, right? Like she comes from the 60s, right? And you see her in the 60s doing old school racism, right? But now she gets it, right? She has adapted, and now she's using social media, right? She's like, look, I can change the narrative just like this. And it just goes to show, right, like the old gripes, the old racism, it's all still there, but it's repackaged in, and frankly, this new postmodern sort of system, right? So anyway, I just think it's really fascinating. It's terrible, obviously, but it's fascinating.
Good points. Sean, what do you think?
Well, I want to say, like, I want to talk later about the body stuff, but something really struck me because there's a paradox going on here between the time of modernity, when we were at the height of modernity with architecture and design, was also a time when before the Civil Rights Act had happened. And then as we started shifting away from that modernist aesthetic, and we had the intellectual rise of postmodernism, then we started to begin to see more rights opening up and things like that. But interestingly enough, it's almost as if the decline of modernism was also opening us up to the decline of civil rights. And so I wanted to talk about this, though, in terms of symbolism, because there's so many famous modern architects that we know and love, like Frank Lloyd Wright and I.M. Pei and Minoru Yamasaki, who designed the World Trade Center. Some of them stressed harmony with nature, and others used these clean geometric shapes and industrial looking design. And some of them were also involved in interior spaces and furniture, like Eames and Le Corbusier. And when we start talking about the politics of modernity, we're also talking about the design of buildings and public spaces. And
absolutely.
Architecture, it shapes how we feel about ourselves and our relationships and society in ways that a lot of people just don't appreciate or comprehend. And so there's been a lot of backlash against these oblique lines of modern architecture. We saw this in the Trump administration, where there was actually an announced policy at the federal level of forcing all new government buildings to conform to neoclassical architectural styles with these Roman-looking ornate columns and triangles. And we also see this drive for conformity in modern suburbia, where all the houses are the same old drab wood and stucco construction, and there's this big drive for uniformity, even of paint colors, and there's homeowners associations to enforce compliance. And so anything modern or unusual is shunned by these people as an eyesore. And so when you think about the 20th century, building the middle class and the expansion of civil rights, you'll associate that time with the rise of modern architecture. And, if you think about these government buildings from the 1960s to the 1990s, they were all built in a modernist, brutalist style. And I personally love those buildings. Think about all the great public libraries and government offices with concrete facades. And there was always a lot of pushback to these buildings, which basically amounted to this just unsupportable personal opinion that they lacked humanity or soul. And this kind of propaganda was also used to criticize, sometimes justly, the mass-produced apartment blocks we saw behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War. We saw the United States housing projects, high-rise housing projects, which could be terrible. And by no means am I saying that mass-produced architecture can't be improved. It certainly can. But the hatred of these building concepts is way out of proportion. The railing against modern architecture really ties back to the spirit matter dualism that we've discussed many times on this show. Because what does it mean to say that a building has or lacks soul? Absolutely nothing. It's a mystical claim, right? And to me, that whole idea of trying is just a way of trying to reify one's personal tastes and to generalize those sort of narrow viewpoints as some sort of fact, and so you'll hear a lot of conservatives talking about these older government buildings now and apartments as ugly, right? Ugly to who? Buildings are inanimate objects, and their structure and design are given life through the interaction with the people who live and work in them. And so what's important to me is both the function and the form, how those buildings serve their occupants, not some idea of soul. And my question is, doesn't it matter more that people have an efficient or functional place to live or work? Clean water, electricity, heating, cooling, public safety. I just think that those are the main concerns. And, so we get into these aesthetic, discussions that are unresolvable. But I do think that there was something great, about the modernist project. And on the other hand, we saw postmodernism kind of understandably arising as a counterpoint to the mass production of the Industrial Revolution, where everything's the same. Way of finding meaning in a world where you've got, identical cars, TVs, and products coming off assembly lines, in these identical suburban houses. And I'm wondering if the American suburbia was all that different really from those old Soviet era apartment blocks. There's been a lot of intellectual hay made about this sort of sameness. But on the other hand, a counterpoint to that is that there's a comfort to sameness, a simplicity. And we've seen that simplicity as a design ethic also expressed in the form of minimalism. And simplicity and minimalism can become a vessel into which people can pour their individuality. When your architecture and furniture is frilly and ornate and frivolous, you're focusing on that busyness, not on yourself and not on reflection. This extends into graphic design. Sans serif fonts are the most readable and the most commonly used, but they lack the embellishment of the old calligraphy or serifs used to kind of provide a flair or maybe a hint of nobility or royalty. And I think so these clean modern lines are a rejection of that old royalty, I think. And this tension is present across the entire world of architecture and design. Democratization in the world's governments led to a dilution of power. These movements are symbolized by, simplicity and clean fonts. Can you even imagine that, like subways and airports, their signs being done in these ornate fonts? It doesn't make any sense. So anyway, this is a long-winded, I'll just finish up here. I can't stress enough how when you look at the absolute gaudy Las Vegas kitsch of the way the Trump family lives, for example, gold-plated this and ornate garbage that they live in. What was the line? Like, it looks like Liberace took a dump in there, It sort of epitomizes the opposite of modernity, and we all recognize it as tacky as hell. The question is, why is it tacky? Why do most people on the left prefer simplicity, minimalism, and modernism? Right-wingers might laugh, but I think it's because we like our complexity on the inside, in our brains, and with nuance. Right? Because these types of forms lend themselves to personal freedom, diffusion of power, and simplicity gives us room to think. And it gets back to your original theme, Joe, about the body and the body politic. Mm-hmm. What kind of freedom can we have if we don't control our own minds and our own bodies?
Right. And a lot of what you said, Sean, really speaks to this transition between modernism and postmodernism. It's really fascinating. I mean, the whole idea of symbolism, right? And how we sort of imagine the world and society and buildings and shapes and bodies. That a focus on that is a postmodern focus, but it's also a modernist focus. The difference is that in modernism, it was about mass culture, about uniformity. And with postmodernism, it's about niche culture and about difference and about diversity. And that part of postmodernism is very interesting. The other thing you mentioned is the idea of shape and the idea of form and space in architecture. But you know what? That shapes the body, because the way we design our buildings and our public spaces and our private spaces changes the flow of people and how they move, where they live, how they act. Right. So that's all related. And it's completely all related to aesthetics, because then we can think about the aesthetics of architecture and the aesthetics of the body and find the similarities there. Like, what is considered ugly? What is considered beautiful? All of that stuff, that plays into this idea of interpretation, right, in postmodernism. So that's the stuff about postmodernism that's really kind of cool and interesting. But as again, later we'll talk about the darker side, right, the shadow side of postmodernism. But
can I just jump in real? Yeah. Can I just jump in real quick? I just wanted, before we move on, I just wanted to mention, you said at the top of your comments, Sean, about how right, the Trump administration mandated government buildings to be constructed in a certain way, and I mean, it's like they were doing, right, because Hitler did the same thing with art, right? And it's like, it's just astonishing, first of all, and this goes back to your earlier point at the top of the show, Sean, and that is, right, that people have forgotten, right, what Nazism was all about, right? And because really what that is about controlling people's minds, it's about controlling people's tastes, it's about radical uniformity, right? And it's just astonishing to be like, you know, I mean, that has Stephen Miller's fingerprints like all over it, right? All over it. Like, this is some straight Nazi shit. Like, that is like, so anyway, it's just astonishing that we live in a time when that just goes by people like, oh, not a big deal. I mean, as soon as you said that, I was like, yeah, that is straight up Nazi shit, like straight up, right?
Well, it is the concept of deviant versus non-deviant art, right? Like, like having to have culture approved through the central. I mean, it's just, it's Orwellian, it's Nazi, it's like fascist. Every bad term that you can think of is what it is when you start trying to reify these aesthetic judgments.
Unbelievable.
And you think about Nazism, think about all the pageantry in it and all of the symbolism in it, right? They play to that big time. And they use those sort of psychological, psychic aspects of ourselves to enforce that ideology in ways that are incredibly sophisticated. And the postmodernists saw that. They saw that aspects of Nazism, and they're like, man, wow, right? What is that all about? Right? Well, and then they expanded on it in a way.
There's been a fascination. There's been a fascination. Sorry, just real quick. There's been a fascination with this iconography and looking at the iconography of the Third Reich, you know, with the eagle and the swastika, and then looking at Soviet propaganda posters. You see, they all take major advantage of modernist design. Some of the best modernist design actually came out of those movements, and it's iconic. And the only other thing that I can think of that's as iconic, if not more so, is the Christian cross. Right? Oh, yeah. Simple, clean lines it kind of define the 20th century.
Interesting. Good point.
And of course, that plays to notions of purity and ideal forms and all that stuff, which in turn, it gets mixed with the pre-modern shit with like body and gender and what's right and what's wrong and what's evil and what's sinful. That all gets mixed together. And that's what Nazism was this sort of flourishing of all of that. And so what I want to do is I want to take a look at an early postmodern critique of the world and why, and that's why I want to focus on Michel Foucault for a little while. I mean, I don't want this to be a treatise on Michel Foucault, right? But I want to just use his theories to sort of as a springboard to talk about other stuff. But Michel Foucault was he was the first openly gay philosopher of the 20th century, the major one anyway. Maybe there's some minor ones first, and it was during a time when, you know, gay rights were perhaps just on the horizon, but they certainly weren't there. It was during a time when his perspective was extremely unique. The idea of thinking about politics of the body was just a radical notion. And Foucault examined in that way contemporary institutions to illustrate, these new and more powerful forms of social controls, like the ones the Nazis were using in modernity. And they were being used to suppress human freedom, right? That was his genius. While the modern liberal order created a lot of new rights and a lot of new freedoms, it also created new and powerful means to regulate behavior that are really difficult to see and to resist. And that's what he was focusing on. He believed the modern state began to regulate social life through controls of the body in far more sophisticated ways that were happening in the pre-modern world. They were less obvious, but just as brutal in many ways than the ones in the past. What defined the pre-modern world is that truth is rooted in God and God's will, and then this is revealed by God's vessels, kings, prophets, priests, and so on. Social control was justified on these terms, and it was absolute and immutable. There's not a lot of messing around there. This impulse officially ended with modernism, where the coming of modernity was secular institutions began to replace a lot of the functions of the church and so forth. Science and the state have taken over as the arbiters of a lot of the truths that we believe in and the way we organize society. And we have human rights now. There's a lot of wonderful things about what happened with modernism. But as Foucault points out, there's a shadow side to all this. The old heteronormative standards may not be officially ordained by God, but they endured. They got carried over, and they became associated with a lot of biological truths that gave them added power. Hence the intersex surgeries I was talking about earlier. Why even in the 21st century we're still doing it. That power endures. Homosexuality went from being a sin to being a mental disorder. That's what I'm talking about here. It was naturalized and medicalized that way. No longer a sin necessarily, although it still was in some quarters, but it was right now it began to be regulated by institutions. And it was cured, right? It was meant to be cured by these institutions, the medical institutions and so forth. And it took literally until the 1990s for homosexuality to be removed from the official mental illness list, right? Gay marriage happened in the early 2010s, and now there's backlash to all that. And we talked about the transgender movement and how they're being particularly targeted today. So to the religious right, homosexuality, transgender identity, abortion are perversions and sins coming from the pre-modern world. But they are using the power of modernity to eradicate them, right? And that's what we need to think about. What we're seeing today is the same institutional apparatus that gave us those rights that we all cherish is being applied now to control the body by anti-liberal, reactionary politics. And this strange fusion between the pre-modern and the postmodern is really akin to fascism. Fascism was kind of the first impulse of that in many ways. And it shares a lot of the same qualities, but it also has, obviously today, a very 21st century feel to it, right? What do you think about this perspective?
Well, I have to say, Joe, that I'm really glad that you studied Foucault, because I did not. I was an engineering major. My minor was in politics. I couldn't get enough politics, by the way. I piled on those electives as much as I could. I avoided postmodern subjects and philosophy in general, kind of like the plague. I actually kind of thought they were non-subjects. I had this disdain in my student days. But now, of course, with all we're doing with podcasts and us having these great conversations, I'm very interested. I'm very interested with the political implications we're talking about of this. It's just another layer below political science and political philosophy that is no less important. And it's like you said, the far left and the far right, the pre-modern and the postmodern all share this absolute rejection of the straightforwardness and factualness of modernity. And I find modernity to be the beating heart of civilization. And it's kind of the pinnacle of what we've achieved. All of evolution has led us to this point now where we can form peaceful and stable societies with a high level of protection for individual rights, with the added benefit of utilitarian and egalitarian politics bolstered by well-designed systems. Any backing away from this modernity, to me, is backsliding toward all the things that made the past a terrible place to live. And of course, it's like the old biblical saying, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Modernity gave us human rights, and now modernity is being used, as you said, to take them away through the apparatus of state power. It's being hijacked by those old reactionary forces. And going back to Hobbes and the state monopoly on violence that we always talk about, democracy was a foreign concept back then. Even Hobbes, in his cover illustration, though, for Leviathan, showed the sovereign as effectively containing the will of the people. But what is the will of the people? That's key. And it's key to political philosophy in general to understand that majorities have often abused their power to distort the will of the people and to oppress minorities without regard for human rights. And that's what we're talking about here. The idea of minority rights has been the basis of constitutional systems, the Constitution itself being a constraint on the power of majorities. And a lot of people have this misconception that democracy is always majority rule, but it absolutely is not. And the most important part of democracy is understanding how minority rights must be protected from the majority. It's not justice when any group is allowed to use state power against unpopular groups. So let's take the intersex surgeries that you mentioned. Now, if under 2% of the population has their genitalia mutilated by intersex surgery at birth, that's already a really small constituency. And by the time any of these victims come of age, they don't have any choice in the matter. They've been surgically altered to fit into our gender boxes, right? So getting people to rally for the rights of intersex babies is a really hard sell. And I found this out years ago when I started talking about genital mutilation more generally. Like, why do we cut the foreskin off male babies? That's half the population, right? It's medically unnecessary and it vastly reduces the sensitivity of the penis for most men. And I brought this up a few years back and started promoting this group Intact America. And I could not believe the hate I got on social media. So mutilation continues. It's tradition. And why don't we protect babies who are completely helpless from suffering this routine life-altering surgery? And, we see this lesson from American history. It wasn't enough to have a Bill of Rights guaranteeing freedom of speech, press, or assembly, or not having to be subject to search and seizure or quartering troops. I mean, those are important. But, I was watching an old George Carlin skit recently, and he was pointing out how we had this so-called Bill of 10 Rights, which it was 10 because it sounds really good, kind of like the 10 Commandments. But in reality, we didn't get rid of slavery until we passed 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, which demonstrates to me how difficult this rights project is. So look, I want to talk a little bit about the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We all know what that is, but the problem with it is that it's not being implemented almost anywhere. Certainly, we don't respect all of those rights in the U.S., and not in almost any country in the world are all of those rights respected. And so, it included social and cultural rights, right to food, shelter, safety, participation in labor unions, freedom of conscience, prohibitions on arbitrary detention, equality before the law. There are active constituencies in this country that are opposing all of those things. And there are, because they're anathema to people who want to control our minds and bodies. They want to persecute people deliberately for their religious and cultural beliefs. It doesn't stop there either. I mean, the illiberal forces that are on the rise worldwide, they're ramping up their direct attack on the human body in super invasive and intimate ways. I mean, when you think about all of these rights that are under attack, forced pregnancy, controlling the woman's body. The right to bear arms comes along with an understanding that tens of thousands of people every year will have their bodies ripped apart by bullets, and we're not going to do anything to stop it. So-called right to work being used to suppress labor unions. Again, controlling what people are forced to do with their bodies to survive, and how much of their time they're forced to sell to corporations, right? Religious freedom being used to suppress LGBT community, which is absolutely about what people are allowed to do with their bodies. Keeping people alive who are in pain. They have terminal diseases, taking away their right to die with dignity. We see it everywhere. Your body, especially if you're a woman, is being taken away from you a little bit at a time.
Yeah. Great points. I did want to say one thing about the far left. Honestly, I do think that we need to discriminate the far left a little bit more. I think there's different factions of it. I think Karl Marx was a classic Enlightenment thinker. He was certainly not a postmodernist. And I think a lot of his philosophies were very much in line with the Enlightenment. And what he did was that he just brought in the issue of class and the issue of injustice and that dimension in a very powerful way. But he was talking about the very same things that the Enlightenment thinkers were talking about in terms of human dignity and freedoms and so forth. And I think there's some of that still left in the hard left. But there's also the ones that really have lost themselves in this post-truth environment as well. So I think it's important to discriminate that. Other than that, I think what you said was great. I just wanted to make that point. So, Christoph, what about your perspective here?
I think as everybody was talking, both of you were speaking, I'm just taken by this idea of, I said at the top, this human ingenuity, the capacity to use good things, positive steps forward, good institutions, and then pervert those into something negative, right? So, I mean, we talked about the, Sean, you mentioned the protection of minority rights and the importance of that, and how that is really unique in human history, right? The protection of minority rights. But then you have the GOP using that concept, right? The filibuster, right? Which is and that is now used as a tool to actually oppress people. So like what you have is the idea, the way the Senate works is designed to keep minorities in with some sort of leverage, but now it's being perverted, right? Right. And now, and you have this with, the government's, right. The government has, you talked about the 14th, 15th, all these amendments, right. And how these really changed America, the fabric of American society. But now you have the modern right using the apparatus of the state to oppress LGBTQ people actively, right?
Yes.
And so it's just astonishing. And I think this fits right into our postmodernist conversation, right? But, and how how postmodernism is this weird, at least on the right, this weird combination, and on the left too, these old ideas fused with this new perversion of the liberation that came along with the idea of postmodernism, but then, and sort of coming up with brand new, fresh ideas on how to oppress people. It makes me despair a little bit about humanity, frankly, right? I've been watching The Expanse, and The Expanse is a pretty depressing perspective on humanity, right? But it's also it's also in a lot of ways far more realistic than based on what we've seen of humanity than, say, Star Trek is, right? Star Trek is hopeful and aspirational, and I love it for those reasons. But in the same way, I'm like, watching The Expanse is this like, wow, right? Like, even when we immediately jump to new and fresh ways to hate each other, and it really can be, it can be really upsetting. I mean, I think that, and I think we've talked about this on the show before, is like when those of us who are paying attention, right? Those of us who are watching what's happening, it could be really difficult to maintain any semblance of hope, frankly, for humanity. So I just wanted to comment on that. The last thing I'll say too is this, is the difference between de jure discrimination and de facto discrimination, right? And that's another, I think, that see this transition, right? There was a time when you could just literally own somebody, right? And that was just the norm, right? And there was no one really questioned it, right? For most of human civilization, right? That was the norm. But how is that really different than a corporation paying you not even a living wage, right? And your entire time having, like you said, Sean, having to sell your labor. I don't know how different that is, but again, these new ideas of how to oppress people without literally oppressing people, right? Anyway, that's just the things that were swirling around my head as we were talking about this.
Right.
It's a little bit like
good points.
Puppet strings versus chains, right?
Totally. Great point. That's a really good analogy. That's a great analogy.
Yeah, it is. And when it comes to the body, I mean, think about slavery, right? If you own a human being, you control their body. You can make them do what you want. You can rape them. You can do whatever you want to do to them. And because you own them, right? Especially chattel slavery in particular, which is the worst form of slavery.
Fused with capitalism, which is just astonishing. Like that, the most American form of capitalism you could fucking come up with. Of slavery you could come up with.
Yeah,
that's exactly right. And in fact, that's what I was getting at. What happened is that the modern forms, which were things like capital accumulation and state the state structure and institutions and so forth. You don't need slaves anymore for that, because you can do the same with other much more insidious and internal forms, right, of control. And I think that, yes, while there was liberalization and emancipation that happened with modernity, and we never ever should forget that, because some people do, and it's a tragedy to ignore the benefits of modernity, because they're really massive. But at the same time, you have the shadow side, where if without the right checks and balances, without the right ethics and the right systems, these forms can be incredibly psychologically oppressive and control human beings and their bodies in ways that were unimaginable in the past, right? And I think that's what we're seeing play out in postmodernity even more in some ways. And then we have to be aware of it and call it out and really be critical of what's happening.
Exactly. No, you're so right. You're so right. I mean, just these debates, they're so insidious, right? Like, there was a time when you could just, if you were taught in school, you were taught in separate schools, obviously, and black people weren't taught at all. Women either, by the way, taught only to a certain extent. And you could just say, right, we have slaves and that's how we live our lives. But now, and so that was just on the top of everyone's mind. But now it's like you said, it's insidious, right? There's illusion of freedom, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, I can go to any job I want. I can quit my job anytime I want, right? As if I have agency. It's like this idea that you have agency that you don't really actually have, right? And that makes it even worse in some ways.
There's some really rich irony there too, because, I'm thinking back to how much everything's about freedom, like George Bush, they hate us for our freedom, it's like that whole thing, right? And yet we don't have it. We don't have it. Most people, the vast majority of people don't have it.
Do not.
And it's interesting going back to the Corey Robin book, The Reactionary Mind, when you look at the way conservatives are motivated, they are motivated by rolling back freedoms that have previously been granted. That's where they get their most jollies from, in this book. And he literally goes through and documents this, right? And so we have, slavery is abolished, but then, you bring in, this capitalism that, puts people in a situation of near slavery, and then you bust the unions, and you oppose every option for people getting free of that. Same thing. We get recognition of gay marriage, and that was only 7 years ago that we got that, and now already they're telling kids they can't talk about their gay married parents at school. Right? It's just so they're always trying to roll it back, and make irrelevant the gains.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and this is a good time to bring in some terms here, because I think we need to sort of clarify these larger themes in our political economy and evolution that we've experienced over the last century. So the central philosophy of modernity, I want to get back to that, liberalism, introduces the idea of individual dignity and democracy and property rights and human freedoms. And by the way, the reason why property rights was so important is because, honestly, the only resistance to the feudal lords, the power of the kings, was like merchants that had a little bit of property. So you think about the Enlightenment thing, because they're like, man, we need property rights, right? Because that was where they were coming from, right? That's the mode of resistance that they saw. But anyway, that's a tangent. But classic liberalism is all about that, right? It's about all of those things that we talked about in the Enlightenment Project, but it's also about reducing the power of government, because again, the governments were totalitarian governments during feudal times, right? And also this new idea, these new ways of thinking, and this invention of mercantile capitalism was really kind of very exciting. So economic productivity was getting really, a lot of interest and so forth. So that was also a focus for the Enlightenment thinkers. And then by the time we get to the mid-20th century, we start to see this Enlightenment project be implemented via a social democratic system, right? Where the government all of a sudden is really more interested in this stuff, in human rights and dignity and so forth. And one of the things that it needed to do was to put checks on the economic powers to do that, right? And so capitalism started to get reined in a little bit, right? And so we had unions, which is again it's an institution of emancipation. A union. You think about the body, right, and the corporate overlords, being able to control how people worked to the extent to which before unions, right, you would have 6-day weeks with 12 hours a day, 5-year-olds in factories and complete control, right, and most people were subjugated under those conditions. And then we eventually got into a better form. We got into social democracy. And then all of a sudden the 80s come along and we reject social democracy. And the Reaganism and the Thatcherism comes in and you get the neoliberal order, which it goes back to that other aspect of classic liberalism, which is all about, reducing government and maximizing economic profit, but for different reasons. Right?
Yes.
Now the reasons were the primacy of the capitalist class, right? Because they did not like the fact that they were checked and balanced in social democracy. So they rebelled. And so we've got classic liberalism, we have social democracy, and now we have neoliberalism, which is, reversing many of the gains that you both talked about with social democracy. And all of these forms rely heavily on the state and modern civic institutions, right? And so what happened is in the pre-social democracy norms, the corporate power became enmeshed with state power fully, right? The business of America is what was the quote? The business of America is the business of
I think the business of America is business. Yeah.
I think that's what it was.
Right. And then social democracy, it became, well, let's talk about the middle class and let's talk about human rights and talk about the minority rights and all that stuff as well. Right. But then what happened is that, again, with neoliberalism, these checks and balances, this merging of the state and corporate thing was, again, on the rise. And now today, what we have is a situation where, basically the state does what corporations want for the most part, 99%, honestly, if you look at the studies. And so I strongly believe that the rejection of liberalism in postmodernism, a lot of people, all this post-truth stuff and all this stuff, is really a disillusionment, not so much of modernity, but it's an unconscious reaction or rejection of capitalism for doing that. Because you think about it, it really got going after with neoliberalism much, much more, didn't it? Think about it, right? I mean, postmodernism as it stands today, right? Before the 1980s, it was more like the early postmodernists where they were talking about the things we talked about earlier, and now it's like this post-truth, this wholesale rejection of institutions and modern project and so forth, alongside with neoliberalism. So capitalism abstracts the individual in terms of self-interest and market forces. But in the beginning, the Enlightenment thinkers were not thinking that way, right? They weren't abstracting the individual. They were thinking about, a collective project that was helpful and beneficial to individual rights. Right, that was all thrown out with neoliberalism, with the Ayn Rand bullshit, and so neoliberalism is this latest plunge into an ethos that led to great atrocities before social democracy, and is leading to great atrocities now. And that's it's a form of collective sociopathy to think in those terms. We are social beings. We are social beings, and capitalism denies that. It functions through controls of the body, to bring the body back here. Okay, I want to bring the body back into the conversation. So it shapes where bodies spend their time and how they spend their time. During the social democracy phase, people worked many less hours. They had many more protections. They were guarded by unions, right? A lot of people just needed one income for a family, right? Today, people work 2, 3, 4 jobs, can't make ends meet, live paycheck by paycheck, don't have the power to stand up to corporate interest. And so corporate interest can control more and more and more of how people live their lives. And so, and by the way, before the social democracy, you had like corporate towns and stuff where they controlled everything about people's lives, right? And we're getting back to that. And we're going to get back to that if we're not careful. So, you know, so we give our bodies to our bosses for money to survive. What does that sound like, guys?
It sounds a lot like slavery.
It sure does.
Or prostitution, right?
If we look at this whole thing, and as you're talking, I'm thinking about this and realizing, and you mentioned Ayn Rand, and it's like it's trauma begets trauma. And Ayn Rand has been extremely instrumental. I mean, she's, you know, she herself like was not a great writer, but she said some very convenient things for capitalists and got a lot of people to buy into this. And what happened to her is that the Soviets seized her family's business. Her family had a pharmacy, and they completely seized the business, put them out of business, and the family fled and came to America. And so for her, it was like having, you know, being able to be in a place where your business is not going to be seized was amazing. And then she started seeing aspects of the social democracy project in the 20th century that were giving workers rights, and it reminded her of how it was in the Soviet Union. So she associated with that with her family's business being seized, and so created this entire you know, body of work from, you know, Atlas Shrugged to The Fountainhead to all that surrounding the individual, triumphant individual as the center of capitalism, when in reality, the reality is exactly the opposite, that individuals are crushed and enslaved by capitalism. And so I think it's just a really interesting just to see how that backlash, you know, she was abused by the hard left in terms of Soviet communism, and then turned around and became a hero of the hard right, you know, which is now oppressing people in maybe even a worse way than happened in the Soviet Union. So this all came through this propaganda. Look at how Russia, you know, as in it's now has become fascist, has gone hard right, and they've been able to completely control their citizens to support the terroristic war in Ukraine through propaganda and even banning certain words. And Orwell didn't even begin to cover what's going on over there right now. And then you still have people talking about how even though Russia doesn't respect free speech, and they still believe that Russian ideas should be able to be freely expressed on American television and radio and all over the internet. Like it goes again to my shirt, give Nazis a platform, right? If we can't shut down this propaganda, we will lose our free society. And because it's a basic lack of understanding of how the world works to think that you could just have unfettered free speech, because there's no such thing as consequence free speech. And every person who claims to value freedom of speech has something they would like to suppress. Even the term is just hypocrisy. You'll hear someone like Tucker Carlson, you know, he wants to spout Russian talking points, but he spends all his time trying to shut down woke viewpoints in America, right? It's not just that he disagrees. He wants these viewpoints to be banned, right? So he's not in favor of free speech at all. And the right gets away with this double standard because they have the power. And that's what I'm saying. Any new sort of constitution that we would have that would take care of these problems would have to contain a blueprint against information warfare. You know, the Second Amendment protects our right to bear arms. That involves physical defense, but the defense against destructive ideas is just as important because they're destroying our civilization. Where is the amendment that protects our children's brains from right-wing indoctrination? And we know that this works. We know that it changes democratic outcomes. We know that ever since Fox News came along, you know, nothing's been the same. So where's the article in our Constitution that demands that our nation be defended from this kind of foreign propaganda and interference in our elections? And the point is that none of these protections exist now, and none of them are likely to ever exist because the forces of feudalism and even postmodernism are cooperating to make sure that going forward, power and money beat truth every time. And when power is allowed to beat truth, eventually that power starts not only killing people, but also directly controlling the bodies of people who are alive. And we just have to, we've said it over and over again, unchecked power is a force of utter immiseration.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Christoph. Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to just comment on what you said earlier up at the top earlier, Joe. And you were talking about how, right, that the government that folks were, that like in 1776, right, when they were opposing, they were opposing a government that was totalitarian, right? A literal fucking king, right? That was what they were opposing, a despotic force, right? And so, and how that has been turned around, it's just astonishing. I'm just commenting on something we've talked about, I guess, throughout the show, but it's just astonishing now that you have these people, right, saying, oh, tyranny this and tyranny that, but they're fighting against, right, the government whose role has changed a lot, right? I mean, we're not talking about the same government that these people were afraid about in 1776, right? We're talking about a government who stands up for minorities, right? Who tries to make people's lives better. But in the process, and this goes to what you're saying, Sean, it restricts the rights of people who are disproportionately powerful, right? And so they have created this narrative which is just really beautiful, if you want, in a sick way, how they have perverted the founding principles of our system, right? To impose a brand new form of the same totalitarianism that was being opposed in the first instance. And I just want to also, this is something that I have been thinking about, and I wanted to mention it, is that I want to differentiate here between exploitive capitalist systems on one hand and market-based systems in general on the other, right? Like I tend to favor market-based solutions. I'm not a communist personally. I'm not really even a socialist. I don't even know that I am a socialist. But I do believe that the proper role of government is to create the political and social and economic environment where everybody has the tools to compete, and that there's a genuinely level playing field on which people can compete. And that means a robust safety net. It means removing certain sort of life-affirming services from the clutches of the private sector. And we have seen things go, it used to be public-private partnerships from time to time. Now the corporations do everything, right? The government barely is in the business of governing at this point, right? So our current market-based system, if you can call it that, is absolutely exploitative. But I don't think it follows, though, that market-based systems are necessarily exploitative. So I want to make that distinction. We need massive structural reforms to even begin to solve the neoliberal mess we are in, and tinkering around the edges of this system will not cut it. And I'm not an ideologue. I'm not interested in being right. I'm interested in reducing human suffering. I think we all are here, right? And if it turns out that communism gets us there, then I will eat my hat. But my point is that, right, like, I resist this, some folks on the hard left who just want to throw out the entire market-based idea in general, right? Who are, and I think that this goes through the freedom of modernity and postmodernity, this idea that, right, that there is a give and take and things are moving around and it's not a top-down sort of approach. And I just wanted, that was something that was kindled in my mind during this conversation, because we talk about capitalism all the time and how fucking awful it is. But that's not the same thing as saying market-based systems are necessarily evil. I think there's a distinction there. No.
What do you guys think? Clear distinction.
Yeah. That's super key. Markets are a great source of information. It's just that when you allow the wealthy and the powerful to capture the government, they can distort markets. And
exactly.
And
then it's not a free market at all.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, let's get back to the modernist project here, because I think it relates to a lot of what you're saying, Christoph. I mean, it's an interesting distinction you're making. I mean, neoliberalism is not what the Enlightenment thinkers had in mind, right? From the framers of the constitutions to the social democracy and even many forms of socialism, happiness is always been a group project that has the goal of emancipating individuals. And the first order of freedom is emancipation from toil and poverty, from sickness and misery, from bigotry and discrimination. That's what we need freedom for, right? Those are the shackles. And this, in a lot of the founding fathers, that term is always a problem. So I like to say framers instead. But this is all done through the public good right? And markets. But the public good is a central aspect of that. And with neoliberalism, it's like, no, it's all markets, nothing but markets.
That's exactly right. It's got to be, right?
It's illusory because a lot of the markets are just bullshit. Yeah,
totally.
Go ahead, sorry.
I mean, no, I'm sorry. That's exactly right. You know, markets ought to be a tool to achieve the goal of reducing human suffering, of increasing people's freedom. It can't be the other way around, right? It can't be markets for the sake of markets, right? And then slap a freedom sticker on that and say, oh, good, we're continuing the modernity project. No, fuck that. And what you said too is so important, right? People aren't really free if they first of all, if they have to work 3 jobs, but if they don't have health care, if they can't, like, how can you compete in a market-based economy if you don't have the tools, if you don't have the baseline tools? And so I think it's just so critical that we on the left, I think, don't abandon the idea or cede that ground of markets, like you're saying, Sean, to the right, but at the same time clarify the proper role of markets in a functioning system.
Right. And I honestly think that's what the post-liberalism project should be, right? We're going to talk about that, right, in this show many times over, I'm sure, in the future. But post-liberalism is not the same as anti-liberalism or illiberalism, right? The human progress envisioned a few centuries ago can be achieved through individual dignity and rights, of course, but also flourishing through the social and public good. In other words, it can be a collective project that is premised on individual well-being. But the way we get there is as a community. And that framework could be a way forward in the post-liberal world. So, all right, enough of that. Let's go back to the body. Before I do that, give me last thoughts, guys. Give me last thoughts.
Quick thing about that, and that
Go
is,
ahead,
I think
Sean.
Post-liberalism is it's getting away from the knee-jerk reaction. Like, a lot of people on the left have a knee-jerk reaction against markets. They have a knee-jerk reaction against privatization. They have a knee-jerk reaction against, all sorts of things. I mean, environmentalists don't even want to put solar panels sometimes in sensitive areas, right? So you have goals, conflicting goals on the left, right? And you have knee-jerk reactions. And post-liberalism to me is systemic, like really analyzing what produces the best outcome, and if it's markets, great. If it's, some people say that it's nuclear power. I'm not one of those people, but, for energy, but make the case, right? If it's if scientifically, it's provable that nuclear power is better for the climate, then let's do nuclear power, right? Let's not have these old liberal shibboleths that we have to live by because it's gospel or something.
Right.
That's so well said, Sean.
Yes.
That's exactly what I'm getting at, right? It's like the goal is not right. I'm not pro X just because I'm committed to that idea. The goal has to be making things better. Whatever gets us there. Like, I have ideas about what that is, and I like my ideas, obviously they're mine, but if your idea turns out that it's a better idea, then damn right, we should go with that, because the goal is to improve people's fucking lives and not destroy the fucking climate, right?
Absolutely.
That's the goal here,
Right.
That's so important. Like, and the knee-jerk reaction on the left, and this is what kills me about the hard Bernie Sanders style left, is that it can be so reactionary in that way. It's like, dudes, like, do you or do you not want to win? Do you or do you not want to move the ball forward? Like, because, anyway, let's not, the symbolists that you said, that's exactly right, Sean. I think that you well said.
Thank you.
All right, so there's so much more we could say here. I just want to say that again, I am a pretty hard leftist. I really am. In some ways, I'm conservative, actually, in terms of some things, like, in the true sense of the word, not in the political sense, but in the philosophical sense, right? But I'm also, in terms of like the climate, I am fucking left, right? I am way out there. I want to see this world survive, right? In terms of socialism, or at capitalism, I'm in the same camp as you guys are. I think what's pragmatic, what works, is what's right for me. That's why I'm wearing this science shirt, right? Evidence-based, not ideological. Right?
Exactly.
But I do think that there's a lot of structures within capitalism that prevent us from exploring and experimenting to those other forms. And that's the problem. Capitalism is not allowing us to do anything else but fucking capitalism. And every single time we
true.
try, they find a way to stop it, and they succeed. That's the problem with it, right? I don't have a problem with markets. In fact, I think worker cooperatives are awesome, and I love to see them compete in an open market, right?
Totally.
There's all of that stuff. But anyway, let's get into biopolitics, because I think that's what people want to hear here.
Yeah,
that's the title of our show and shit, right? So control of the body has arguably been the central means to achieve social and political supremacy, right? And so all the things we've talked about, you, Sean, and Christoph, and so forth, think about where the point of the spear is. It's on the fucking body. It's on abortion rights. It's on transgender rights. All about the body still. No matter all this higher level lofty stuff, that's where the action is. That's where the rubber meets the road, right? And so the political supremacy of the body is really important. And so let's talk about some specifics in terms of Foucault again. He talked about the panopticon, as it described in his book, The Discipline and Punish. It's a layout used by modern prisons, right? As opposed to the dark, forgotten dungeons of the Middle Ages, right? It's a well-lit space, right? Designed to maximize surveillance. And it's designed to maximize people's movements and how their relationship to each other and so forth. It's very, very different in pre-modern times, where punishment included torture, dismemberment, and dark dungeons where people just disappeared and just withered away, right? In the modern world, punishment and discipline revolve around marking spaces and surveillance, as I said. And then inmates learn to behave in accordance to the rules simply because they know they are being constantly observed. And the physical punishment becomes mostly unnecessary. The bodies of the inmates are controlled. And then because you're controlling their bodies, you're controlling their minds. You're shaping their behavior. That in turn becomes internalized and mostly voluntary, and you've won. And that is, Foucault argues, the way all modern institutions can function, right? People will act properly because they are under forms of latent nonviolent control of this magnitude, right? Liberalism may have given people freedom, but societies have found a way to render that freedom largely illusionary by limiting possibilities to what is normal and accepted, right? And there are some things that just get written off as idealistic, as utopian, as unnatural, and people don't even consider them. And they're not, right? But they're written off that way because we are shaped to think only in very specific ways. So that internally shapes our lives, both deeply on a personal basis and also at the ballot box. So the power over bodies is the power over life. And that's what biopolitics is, right? It's accomplished through these obscured, right, forms of institutional control, as Foucault explains. They are the root of this thing called biopolitics. So gentlemen, I want to bring you both in at this point. What do you think of this Foucaultian biopolitics sort of framework and this notion about how control happens in the modern world and in today's world?
The short answer is I'm on fucking board. Like, this is, I think, exactly right. I mean, right. It's instead of the ham-fisted way that we used to control people, right? It's just now done much more delicately, and it is right. And I think that the prison analogy is a very, very good one. And I'll just comment on. We were talking earlier about project buildings and just how people, let me back up. When you put people in a certain condition, you can be pretty sure of how they're going to operate, right? So we like to think that we have individual control, that we make these decisions and stuff like that. But so much of it is controlled by the systems we live in, right? We mostly do what the people around us are doing. And I think that if you can control the system, if you can create, and I think that's what you've done, if you are a postmodernist or if you are a modern conservative, is you create this system that gives you the illusion of choice, that gives you the illusion of autonomy, when in fact it does not, because you're controlling the actual structures of the system. It reminds me of the Matrix, right? Is that you plug people in and you just give them this idea of that they're actually living a life. and they will just be a little battery for you, right? And that is what we see here in corporations. We see this in any totalitarian state, certainly over in Russia.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've actually gone and built that perfect panopticon that was mentioned in the Foucault article. Okay. This goes far beyond prison. We know that information from your social graph can basically predict your behavior and your politics. And when someone else knows how you're going to behave. Level. Right. I mean, there was that, I think it was in Homo Deus where Yuval Noah Harari mentioned the study that said that by looking at a certain number of posts on social media, they can predict your behavior and your politics. They know you better than your family. They know you better than you know yourself. And if someone else knows that, they can find the levers to control you, right? And there's a couple of principles that we need to think about. To your point, Joe, a well-lit prison where you're under constant observation might be even more dehumanizing than a dark dungeon where at least you might have some privacy, right? Speaking of privacy, though, in a robust democracy with strong checks and balances and minority protections, surveillance is less of a concern than it would be because you have recourse. And we already know the government is listening to every phone call. We know that the internet is monitored and all that data is sucked up, but it can't be used against us right now without a court order. And so it's not the privacy that's the issue. A judge is not going to give out a surveillance order without a really strong probable cause. And so, and robust democracies are good at holding corporations to account so that it would be illegal to use your private health data to raise your health insurance premiums, just like Obamacare made it illegal to use pre-existing conditions against people. We can protect ourselves even with the panopticon, right? But it is the point here is that in a free society, no amount of surveillance can take away your rights. In a totalitarian society, laws won't protect you and surveillance can be absolute. So the question of surveillance and data gathering really can't be separated from the type of governance that you have. The second point I want to make is to talk about David Brin in his book, The Transparent Society. He was writing this in the 90s. Yeah. In the 90s, right? Before a lot of what we know as the modern internet even existed. And he correctly predicted a lot of the issues that we're now facing. His solution was not to restrict data gathering. It was to be sure that those with less power were also gathering data on those with more power. And in the book, he coined the word surveillance, and that's S-O-U-S valence. He talked about surveillance from the bottom up, which is the reverse of the panopticon, right? Which is a tool of power and a tool of looking downward, right? So he's talking about accountability, and this is what we harp on all the time. I think we can all agree that a transparent society is much better for all parties than an opaque society because privilege and injustice thrive on secrecy. But if we think about the concept of privacy, it has a real downside. Sure, we don't want our dirty laundry aired to everyone. We don't want someone listening when we're having an argument with our significant other. We don't want to be spied on. But I want to turn it around and demonstrate what we've lost when we worry about privacy. Because what does the word privacy bring to mind? One thing is private bodily functions, private parts. Why do we want to keep those parts private? Because we all have them. They all look pretty much the same. Think about all the shame that surrounds the body. And what is that shame but the desire to keep the bodily functions that we all share somehow secret? And why does it need to be a secret? The more open we are about all the things all of us do with our bodies, the freer we can be, and the more accepting of the bedroom habits of other people we will be, in my view.
Right. You know, what that makes me think of, Sean, is that we need to have a multidimensional approach to this. It can't just be about one thing. It can't just be about freedom. It can't just be about privacy. It can't just be about rights. It has to be how the whole system works together. Right. And then what the outcomes are, you know, and you're absolutely right. If we have the checks and balances, if we have the freedoms, we have the protections, then we can tolerate a lot more. Right. Then because we have those protections. And that also gives us the opportunity to do the good things about not having privacy. Like, for example, the fact that, you know, oppression gets opened and seen. Right. You can be very oppressive in private. Right.
That's right.
There's all these reasons. But one of the things
we never would have had any of the changes with police violence that we did if it wasn't for cell phones.
Exactly. It's such a great point. Both of you guys are making great points here.
Right. And of course, the body cameras take away the privacy of the police, but that's not bad. I don't mind that.
There you go.
Right. No, not at all. Right. I mean, it's all about governing well. It's all about creating the right incentive. Right. And the thing is, like, when there's a difference between airing your dirty laundry on one hand and the transparency that comes along. It makes people behave better, and particularly people in power. That's why all the dark money that's going into the government. That's why they want that secrecy, right? So it's just it really is important. Really is important.
And transparency, absolutely, yeah. Transparency is so key. But let me talk about something else with Foucault that I think is really critical here, and that he talks about how science and anatomy, the science of anatomy, I should say, introduced a new regiments of truth. Pre-modern times, God, religion, truth were about God and all that. And they were replaced by institutional truth based on this emerging biological knowledge, which is a good thing in many ways. But the old pre-modern norms about the body didn't go away. They became embedded into the new scientific understandings of human bodies and the new norms in modern world, right? In other words, the norms were naturalized, and that gave them a new form of modern legitimacy and power, right? Biology, this is essentially the dark side, the shadow side of biopower, right? An example many of you may have heard is scientific racism in the late 19th, early 20th century, right? Is all justified by institutions. Another is how women have been treated so differently than men in medicine across the 20th century, right? Given gender-specific mental health diagnoses like histrionics, right? While actual physiological, real menstrual symptoms were written off as imaginary. Again, I'm talking about the modern world here, right? I think things have changed in the last 20, 30 years, but this is the problem with we have to sort of disentangle and deconstruct. And that's what postmodernity is good at. That's what it did for us in the beginning, right? These modern modes of thought are still quite powerful today, and they're being reinvigorated because religion's coming back, right? The pre-modern's coming back. So they're being reinvigorated with extra power. I mean, you see what I mean, guys? I mean, can you think of other examples along those lines?
Well, look, I mean, when the doctors and scientists were all white and male, they would have discounted medical symptoms and concerns that weren't important to them. And it doesn't even take malice, although I think there was malice. Okay. People tend to focus on problems that they can personally relate to. And that's why it's so important to the goal of making our medical norms more inclusive to increase the percentage of women and people of color joining the STEM fields. But I want to also talk about the encoding of these ancient pre-modern attitudes, including racism and discrimination, into artificial intelligence going forward. And that problem, it's come up in so many areas, right? And of course it would, because human beings, they contain the whole raft of prejudices. And if we encode our basic social assumptions into our AI tools, then those tools will give us really prejudiced results. And we've seen, you guys have heard about this. It came up in 2016 where Microsoft tried to make a chatbot, and they trained it using a bunch of tweets, and the tweets ended up being, they were very racist and sexist. And so the chatbot came out with a bunch of racist and sexist statements, and it was so bad they couldn't fix it, and Microsoft ended up abandoning the project. We've seen this issue with facial recognition, and how it didn't work initially on darker faces because, it was a problem with photography, but it was also a problem of training. They didn't train these facial recognition systems, on faces of color, because in America, they're the minority. So you have these compounding problems that based on the way systems used to be, that are now coming forward and breaking the systems that we need to run our future.
Yeah. Good points. Christoph, what do you think?
Oh, I don't know that I have anything new, but what we were talking about, this problem of the white male of a certain weight, size, age, etc., is sort of like the default person, right? Like that, like historically,
the norm.
Like in the United States, that's sort of like the baseline, right? So, I mean, and this is something and I don't know if this is actually true, but, so I'm maybe just starting a rumor, but seriously, there is a, I read about, this idea that women are always cold in office buildings, right? Like it's like a classic thing, right? They have heaters under the thing and blankets and everything like that. And the idea is that the average, the baseline temperature was modeled around a white man, right? And men and women, perhaps men and women are different in terms of just body mass. That can make a huge difference in that situation, right? Same thing with like crash test dummies, right? This has been a problem too, right? Women get killed by airbags more often because they were not built. But so you have this issue. And just before I hand it off here, you were talking about the medical element, and I just recently I was watching this black woman comic, and she was talking about something that, in the way comics do, they talk about really big oppressive ideas and resistance, but in a way that is so palatable and easy to understand. And she's talking about how women, that studies are coming out that show that women's period cramps are online with what the pain of someone experiences with a heart attack, right? And then people are told, oh, don't worry, just go to work. No big deal. Write these symptoms off as not a big deal. What are you talking about? It's histrionics, right? I mean, it's just astonishing.
It still happens.
And this is what happens, right? And it still happens, and women still have to get up and go to work. And if we men had to deal with that, we'd probably think we were dying, we would probably think we were dying. And it's just an astonishing thing. And the modernity, the amendments, all this stuff, the post and the good parts about postmodernism and is that we're having this conversation, right? The fact that we're even at this point, that's good. That's a good start, but it's certainly not enough. And I mean, that blew my mind when this woman tells me that, oh my God, bad period cramps can be in the same pain of a fucking heart attack. Like, wow. And you have to go through that every month, right?
Yeah.
It's just astonishing.
Right.
No, it is. And I think we need to talk about it, and men need to be willing to talk about it because, men get cramps and,
right.
And I don't know if, anybody else has had a serious prostate cramp, but you can't do anything. You're like gone. You're out of commission for like 15, 20 minutes, and think about women are living with that for days and they're working through it.
Yeah.
That's it's such an important thing. It's such an important thing.
So a couple of things I want to say about the idea of making the workplaces more diverse, into STEMs more diverse. Okay. So systemic problems require systemic solutions. I think it's great to do that, but just replacing bodies is not going to work because what happens is you have backlash. You have to go deeper than that. Yes, we have to diversify, have more people of color, more women in different fields. And that's absolutely a number one requirement. But we also have to deal with why. Why is it all white men to begin with? That's what you have to have. You can't just replace bodies there, right? You have to replace systems. And that's one of the things I think that we've not done a very good job on the left in America. We focused in on one dimension of it, which is a critical dimension, but we did not focus in on the other one. And it's about power, right? And it's about really challenging notions of power more than anything else. Not, and that's what we need to go. That's the post-liberal challenge. Yeah, totally. And that has to do with capitalism. It has to do with systemic racism. It has to do with forms of patriarchy that are really quite insidious still and around. Like you guys just mentioned, you just gave some great examples of that. So that's it, guys. That's the challenge. So let's delve a little deeper here. Though in the modern world, people are judged according to their deviation from norms. We've talked about this in the show already. You guys mentioned some good aspects of that. These believed anatomical truths, right? Body shape, ideal forms, people's weights, their heights, their color, their textures, their body shapes. And of course, the more one deviates from those norms, right, the harder life is for them. That's really what it comes down to, right? The more they are shunned, the harder it is to get a job and all of that stuff. And that's why we have all white men in the STEMs, until recently, and still in many cases. These norms are amplified by many institutions, right? They're amplified over and over again by the fashion industry, entertainment, education, medicine, and all these other institutions. And while society has challenged all of this to a lesser or greater success, much of it has simply begun to take new, more insidious forms. Like both of you have mentioned earlier, Sean, you talked about how, AIs, that are starting to mimic these pre-modern, atrocities, really, of thought. And so big tech, right? Social media and so forth. We've all seen it. We've lived it. We've experienced it. We know what's going on. So let's put some thought behind it. Let's sort of deconstruct it, right? In that way, right? These are idealized, naturalized norms of the pre-modern past. Man over woman, white over black, straight over gay, cis over trans. All of these are transmuted through time, but they endure. They endure. These norms, if anything, have been enhanced by science and technology now in many ways. And yes, we can talk about high tech, and we can certainly see that in social media, but it has been that way across modernity. And that's what led the world in early modern times to the 3 nightmarish decades of the mid-20th century. The apex of all that was Nazi Germany. But now we have to see those same phenomena in our 21st century world, which is a postmodern world. It goes back to neoliberalism, right? It's created vast inequalities of wealth and halted social progress. It's destroyed environmental stewardship. And we've talked about all that. Postmodernism is a very complicated thing to understand. This intellectual impulse where truth becomes a political project was at first not a denial of truth, right? It was a rejection of truth as it stood. All of these norms were challenged, right? And that was what the good part of it, right? It was a necessary impulse at the time. The norms carried over from the pre-modern world and force need to be challenged. And we still need to do that. But we have to do it without falling into this fucking rabbit hole of thinking that there's no truth, right? And challenging science. That's really where we have to go. That's the post-liberal challenge we have, right? The early postmodern period is when liberal rights were extended to people once considered deviant. Literally, that's what it was, right? Most of the freedoms gained by women and people of color, while they did start earlier than that, really did not truly manifest until after World War II. The rights of the LGBTQ plus community are only now coming into fruition, right? These are the good things that were spearheaded by this challenge to the modern norms that were carried over from pre-modern times. Unfortunately, as we talked about, this project is morphing into something altogether different. The idea that truth is imaginary, shape of the greatest voice, the greatest power, right? Literally and ironically, that takes us back to a state of might is right, which was very similar to the pre-modern age. It's maddening, right? The tools of the postmodern have been expropriated by the traditionalists. Oh, God. I mean, and those who seek liberation from liberation have that power now. How do you square, here's the question, folks. How do you square the good and the bad about postmodern thought?
Really great point. And I share your frustration. The whole element of, in The Reactionary Mind, definitely one of our favorite books around here. Everyone out there, if you haven't read it, you definitely should. But I think one of the main things, that I took away from that book is how the reactionary politics, co-opts the strategies of progress. And that's what we're seeing, right? It's like, oh, we don't like state power, but now actually we're going to use state power because we don't like state power because it's a liberating force, but actually now we're going to use state power as an oppressive force, right? And it's really, it's maddening. It's really frustrating. I think that what we try and do on this show, and I think that all the three of us try to do in our lives, is try to point out to people the system that they're in. And I think that's like the big thing here is that the whole thing about the Matrix is that they're compliant because they don't realize the system they're in. right? They don't realize that how much of what they're doing and what they see is so controlled. And so, and that's why, this is why propaganda is so big. This is why, the first thing that any totalitarian does is shut down the media, right? This is why, the TikTok has been throttled in Russia as we speak. So I think that one of the things we could do, I don't know how we square this, but what I do know is that we can use the tools of postmodernism, the deconstruction, right? We can use the freedom of thought. We can use this stuff as tools to point people at the system they're in. It's like, no, dude, this, and also point out that this isn't inevitable. That's a big thing. People think that the way things are right now is inevitable. So why try? And I think that, that's what we can do. It's, look, we try to do that on this show, with every episode. And, and I think that is how we try to square it. We use those tools just like they use the tools. We use the tools too. And we point out the system that we're in.
Well, it's very important, and there's an irony as I'm listening to what you're saying, Christoph, and what you were just saying, Joe, about how it all wraps around, right? Because initially, postmodernism was a reaction against a monolithic imposed truth of a totalitarian truth like Nazi Germany or like Soviet propaganda, whatever. Mm-hmm. And so it was a deconstruction, right? An attempt to deconstruct this and come up with ways to survive that environment where, you can find truth and meaning in other things that are not part of this monolithic imposed truth. And same went for, white male, textual, deconstruction, of all these white male authors and all that thing. So it is definitely like power versus truth, and it wraps all the way around. And I think it can kind of become like the snake eating its tail a bit. And I don't think anybody here is going to find it shocking that I advocate a return to a more objective concept of truth with science as the arbiter of what that means. And of course, that would require checks and balances on a lot of very powerful people who currently oppose and mock science. And it also might require a tightening of what's considered acceptable in terms of free speech. Not so much in terms of government legal action, but social norms. I think we need to dramatically downrank the value of people's personal opinions and hold people socially accountable to truth and best practices. And when I mean truth, I mean like evidence-based, right? We've got to stop reopening old and settled issues. It should be considered shameful to express these widely discredited opinions, especially conspiracy theories, because these actions cause direct harm. I mean, denial of scientific facts has been hugely implicated in prolonging and worsening a whole series of crises from lead poisoning to climate change to COVID, right? And it's way easier said than done because wide swaths of the population are invested in this conspiracy nonsense. And this state of affairs has occurred due to cynical influence campaigns that are about only power. And we have so very many examples of how these excesses have led to human catastrophes. I mean, we talk about it till we're blue in the face. Nazi Germany, those ideas came from the eugenics movement in the United States, and that movement came straight out of the Confederacy, the KKK, the America First movement. But taking the long view, American propaganda tactics will probably be regarded as foundational to global totalitarianism because the very Bible of this, a book called Propaganda, was written in 1928 by American public relations guru Edward Bernays. And everybody has to read this book because you got to read it to believe it. It's so cynical and devious. It's kind of like to information warfare. It's very much like Sun Tzu's The Art of War is to war. And it covers this intersection between psychology, democracy, culture, and capitalism, right? And it's a how-to manual for powerful people who want to manipulate public opinion. And we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of the publication of this book. And we're literally living in the world that Bernays built. And that's a world of post-truth tactics. And, you could just go through, the entire 20th century and even up until now, genocides, the Holocaust, crop failures, starvation, Rwanda, Myanmar, and Ukraine, even, where these genocides are taking place, all based on propaganda. We have to realize that even within dictatorships, tyrants still care about controlling public opinion. And that's why TikTok is being banned. That's why, all these social media cutoffs, the Great Firewall of China. Neither genocides nor atrocities can happen without some form of popular consent, even if that consent has to be manufactured. Because, as we know, humans naturally recoil against organized murder, so murderous leaders must formulate a broadly accepted justification for their scorched earth wars and pogroms. We know how this works. It's much less clear how to stop it.
Yeah,
it's true.
Well, given all this, let's take a quick turn to the alt-right populist movement of our age today, right, in America. We've talked a little bit about it already, but, you know, the alt-truths led to the Trump presidency, and, you know, it's a blend of pre-modern forms of truths based on God and might. It's a postmodern legacy. It's all the things we've just talked about. But it comes right down to it. It's the modern forms of control that how they plan to enforce their power and their supremacy, right? They want to use the state and civic institutions like the educational system, the healthcare, the courts to enact this agenda. And notice how many of the laws recently in like places like Texas employ the art of citizenship surveillance, right?
Oh, terrifying.
That's
terrifying.
You know, that's the parallels to, you know, to totalitarian 20th century states couldn't be clearer, right? It's no different than what happened in the 1930s. We understand the state-sponsored racism. We understand the racial purity law. At least people who watch the show do, right? We understand those reinforced norms. Aside from the genocidal episodes that we mentioned in the 20th century and today, these norms act to create a hierarchical social order in a way that, as we said, is more insidious than that of pre-modern times. Any deviation from that normalcy of that order was and is deserving of some kind of punishment, and in some cases, elimination altogether. Whether this is the extreme form of Nazism or something less violent, more subtle in modern states, this is what happens in modern societies. For the LGBTQ plus community, the suppression of deviancy went well beyond the ranking of people based on ideal norms, and that turned into apartheid states or caste systems and so forth. In the case of sexual and gender deviancy, the goal is to eradicate, right? To make disappear of those human beings. And they don't even belong in the lowest rung of the social ladder. In democracies where there are no gas chambers for the transgender or the queer or anyone else that fits that mold, right? The way to eliminate these deviancies is through medicine and other forms of institutional control. Sexual deviancy meant one could not hold a job, get benefits, be accepted in any way. Norms in that way act as a quiet form of genocide. And we have to make that clear. And this is where it really gets complicated, because the postmodern that celebrated the ideas of plurality and difference, like Foucault, right, that deconstructed these norms, really led to liberation against a lot of that. And we need a synthesis now, folks. We need a post-liberal alternative, something that incorporates the good things about modernity and the good things about postmodernity, and throws the rest out in the dustbin of history.
That's right.
So let's turn to that. Let's first start. Some examples here, and then we'll go to finish off with some postmodern, post-liberal notions about where we should go. How do you square the "don't say gay" law in Florida and the "spy on our neighbors" thing about transgender rights and abortion in Texas, given all this?
All I know is that when I was growing up, and, you know, my parents were very anti-communist, and one of the things that they told me about Russia at the time, or the Soviet Union, was that people spied on each other, and people would rat each other out for talking a certain way or for expressing certain viewpoints, and that, you know, potentially children might inform on their parents, you know, and the children were taken away from their parents and taken to, in schools to be indoctrinated. Right. And so that stuck with me. I mean, I was probably 5 or 6 when they were telling me about this. And, So this idea, and we're seeing that now, we're seeing kids, secretly taping their teachers in class with cell phones. We're seeing, this is already starting in the US, and the idea that, there are civil lawsuits being used to enforce laws that are almost like, it's almost like a bounty. You're collecting a bounty to turn someone into the government. And, and they're also going after speech. They're going after free speech, which, these are people who supposedly support the First Amendment, and yet they're going after free speech. And, it's hard to know where to start, because they rail against this academic censorship on college campuses, but then they're doing the same thing. And they turn around and advocate for censorship in public schools, human rights violations against people they disagree with, like women who want abortions or people who want gender affirming care. And it's just so far beyond hypocrisy and double standards. It's like heads I win, tails you lose, right? We understand this is about enforcing their power. It's about turning the tables permanently on the liberal consensus and abolishing any sort of human rights framework. It's about implementing the conservative moral hierarchy by force of law. And by the way, that extends, as we've both of you have talked about, beyond just women, people of color, or the LGBT community. Conservatives are involved in body shaming, fat shaming. Their approach to healthcare is full of victim blaming. I mean, we here, on this show simply can't imagine victim blaming someone who needs medical care, but conservatives do just that. We've seen, for example, efforts to cap monthly insulin fees at $35 a month being voted down unanimously by Republicans. Who doesn't want to give people medicine? Well, they don't. And not only do they not want to pay for it, but they have this pervasive idea that if you're a diabetic, it's your fault. You lack discipline in your diet. You should be punished for it. Same thing with obesity. I've heard conservatives, many of whom are obese, talk about not wanting to pay for healthcare for people who eat badly or are overweight. So I got nothing to deal with that level of hypocrisy.
Right. The hypocrisy, it really is astonishing, or actually it would be astonishing if we didn't know it so well. Right. We see this all the time. And the victim blaming, I mean, it is just, it's all about enforcing power at the end of the day. Like, that's what it comes down to. And that's why they can, because the goal is not human flourishing, right? The goal is domination. It doesn't matter how much hypocrisy there is. And this goes right into our postmodern discussion, right? What difference does it make what truth is? Truth is what we say it is, right? Truth is whatever is in the service of power. And it's depressing. I remember growing up, and I've said this before on the show, and I'll say it again, I had this idea that conservatives that we all had the same goal. We all wanted society to be better, that we all wanted people to survive. They have a different way of getting there, but we all agree that Americans should be better off, right? That is definitely not true. It's become less and less. It's just simply not true. And they were able to sell it as true for a very, very long time. And there's still some conservatives out there, the Mitt Romneys of the world, who think that they're hanging on. But really, at the end of the day, it's like, it's power. It's enforcing power. And you mentioned Russia. We've talked about Russia a lot here, and I've been saying this since the beginning of the Ukraine thing. Not Ukraine thing, that the war, the genocide. Let's call it what it is. But I've been saying this, and that is, Russia right now is the future of the United States if conservatives get their way. Like, that is the most, like, that. It's a very modern form of an authoritarian state, where a lot of people do live just fine as long as you don't say certain things. And there really are Russian. I read a Washington Post article about it this week, right? People turning in their teachers, people turning in to like, right. And ratting on their colleagues. I mean, on their friends and their colleagues. Like, this is happening right now. And we're seeing the buds of that here in the United States as well. And the last thing I'll say is how you mentioned, Joe, how norms can be genocidal, right? Norms can be genocidal. Right now, that I just saw again this week, if a transgender person is accepted by their parents, right? Is not accepted by their parents, those suicide rates are at 41%. 41%, right? Like that is if they're not at all, and on the other hand, it drops to 4% if they're accepted by their parents, whether or not society accepts them, right?
Yeah.
It is right. So, and it just goes to show the power of norms. If you are in a church where transgender people are bad or deviant or whatever, and you could end up essentially killing your child, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about here. And it is, so again, just really astonishing. In terms of what we do about this, man, like, I mean, we have to win. Like there is no debate to be had here. And what we have to do is win over the middle, right? And that might mean some conservative people as well, people who are conservative relative to us. Yeah. It doesn't, but we cannot. But we can't, and it's tricky because we can't capitulate. We can't say, like, we can't give in, because people say, oh, meet me halfway. But like, I don't meet you halfway on transgender people's existence. Like, there is no fucking halfway there. So it makes it really, really difficult.
Well, it's really kind of quaint because we go back and we look at what the debates used to be, 15, 20 years ago with conservatives. And it's like, honestly, right now, I don't give a fuck whether you want to cut taxes for rich people. Like, we have a nation to save. I care if you want to abolish elections, and I care if you want to,
exactly.
You know what I'm saying? Like, we are down to the point where it's like, in terms of like economic policy and those kinds of things, like, it's like, I'm not even going to bother with that. Like, we can fix that stuff once we have protected our elections.
Exactly. Right. I mean, it's just the bedrock of a fucking democracy, and we're having a debate about this. I mean, it's hard, man, and it's hard to find reasons to be hopeful. It really, really is. And I think that's our challenge, right? To find a way to, because all we can do in a democracy is persuade people, right? We can't force people to do anything. So we can persuade them. And the question is, how do we best persuade people? And, that's I think, all hands on deck in terms of how we persuade people. Anyone's ideas on how we persuade people, I think, are critical here.
Yeah, absolutely. Some great tactics there. I think we do need to think about the power dynamics, winning elections, coalitions, all that stuff. It's not easy work. It's very challenging. You try to reach out to the middle, and then you turn into breaking up the left, right? And you start to have problems on the left when you go to the middle. Right. It's really challenging. But so what we need to do, I think, is create a sort of a post-liberal mission statement in some ways. Like, how do we get there? What do we do? I mean, you guys have any thoughts about that? Can you give me some objectives that we could include in this mission statement? Maybe we move from there.
Well, these are kind of obvious, and we've maybe covered them, but number one, reinvigorate institutions which discover and mediate truth. Research, universities, government agencies that their job is to study certain things. The CBO, right? I mean, like there's organizations that are nonpartisan, that are objective. We need to get those people back into fashion and fend off the attacks against them. We need to establish number two, establishing systemic feedback against the spreading of falsehoods. And that means, it means social media moderation. It means suppressing of disinformation and trolls and foreign actors who are attacking us. Okay. That's going to run afoul of free speech. We got to figure it out. 3, increase transparency for governments and corporations. We need to keep the lights on. We need to be able to, have sunlight in everywhere. We can't be having, secret meetings and people destroying documents and all the kind of stuff that happened during the Trump administration. That's got to be, there's got to be heavy penalties for that stuff. And number 4 would be, empower impartial referees at all levels of society. And I wanted to bring up something about that, is that the Republicans have just withdrawn from the Presidential Commission on Debates.
I saw that.
And this is another example of them wanting to just eliminate anybody impartial, because they don't want a fair fight. They don't want to argue their case. So we've got to get these impartial referees back. And that means we're talking about, like impartial news media, like, Walter Cronkite and these guys who used to tell us, how it was, and everybody believed them. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to, when you've got so much fragmentation, but we need that impartiality like nothing else.
Right. Christoph, do you have anything to add?
I do. And here's what I think. My wife and I this morning, we went to Home Depot. I try to go to Lowe's. I feel like it's a better company, but that's neither here nor there. But we were at Home Depot, and I'm paying for some topsoil, and I was like, look, I wanted to ask the guy. I didn't, but I wanted to know, like, are you unionized here? And I didn't ask him because I know that they're probably not, because it's Home Depot. And I think the guy who runs Home Depot is a real shithead, like a Trump guy and everything.
Yeah.
But my point is this. That's where I think you start, because people who are in unions, first of all, it creates community and it keeps brotherhood and solidarity, right? And especially a modern union that is not as segregated by race as old unions had been in the past. Even though by 1960s standards, unions were still great, right? If you were black, you wanted to be in a fucking union. That made you way better off, right? The reason why I say this is because when I was driving back it was in LA, and I was I think it was when I went to see you, Sean. I was on my way back in the Uber, and the person that I spoke to was talking about how I was in Florida. And she was like, oh, I'm from New York, and I used to work in this union. And she was like, down here in Florida, they just don't treat you right. Like, da-da-da-da. And she was, but probably not particularly sophisticated, but she was able to talk about these issues because she had been in a union, right? Because she understands why voting matters. She understands why working together matters. She understands solidarity. And so if you start on that granular level, I think you can start to branch out. So that's why I think, like, the Amazon thing, it was so fucking important, right? Like, so how you get to that point is, I really wanted to just be like, start going to Home Depot and like handing out, like, pamphlets, but I mean, they would kick me out of there real fucking fast for that. But my point is that, like, I think that if you start, because that's how you get average people's head in the game, right? Yes. People like the three of us who read a lot and we're well educated and all that kind of stuff. That's one class of person. But if you really want to change things, you got to make the people who are down there, right at the bottom of the income scale, who are getting fucked by these big companies, who are working jobs, who don't have benefits, who are classified as independent contractors, even though they're definitely not independent contractors. Right. Like, if you get these people together, that's how you switch the majority. I think, what's his face? Bernie Sanders is really good at this, like real good at this. And that's why he's gotten the closest as anybody to making that kind of a change. So I think, like, that is at the bedrock to change people's minds at that level and engage them civically. So they're not just completely distracted by their phone or by whatever else is going on in the world. And I love my phone, don't get me wrong, but I mean that people realize that there's a system here that I'm a part of. And that's what unions do. They make people realize that, holy shit, like, I'm in a system here, and that person is not on my team. Like, right? They're not on my team, and I better band together with my brothers here. So anyway, that just popped in my head literally in the last 5 minutes. But that's where I think that I think that's a good starting point.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think unions are central to this. Central. I mean, historically, the precedent couldn't be stronger about how powerful they can be, and also the fact that more and more Americans are becoming all unified under that banner of being fucking, poor and mistreated, and that's a common ground. I mean, think about the word itself, union, right? Yeah, that's what it's about. And so it could be a potential way of uniting behind a common ground, a common goal. And always the challenge is the divide and conquer, cultural stuff, the racism and the sexism and all that stuff that the reactionaries use to try to divide and conquer unions. They do that all the time. And also finding the innate, racism and bigotry within us too. That's a challenge as well. All of that. But if you look at history, and by the way, I want to do a show on the IWW at some point, like the Wobblies, because I think it's like a lost history, right? That was a radical union. It did a lot, and it's been wiped away from history. Yeah. And right. We just like we introduced the Tulsa massacre, right, back into our consciousness, because it's important to do that. We have to introduce our lost history about who we are, right? Our progressive history. because it's powerful, man. And it's been wiped away so many ways by neoliberalism and the capitalist class. They just, it's there though. Let's get it back. All right. So the great stuff, guys. I think we've gone pretty far with this show. It's been, I think, at least 2 hours or so forth, but I think we got a lot of interesting conversation out of it. I hope you all enjoyed it. So remember, if you like our show, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, check out our Patreon, tell your friends to listen. New episodes post Mondays at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. We also publish new articles weekly in our journal at theradicalsecular.com. I'm Joe Kipinti. Thank you so much for being here. And remember, wherever you are, you can be radically secular.
Radical Secular Podcast is written and produced by Christoph Defoe, Sean Prophet, and Joe Okipinti. Logo and main title designed by Tim Stetner. Post-production and original theme music by Sean Prophet. Special thanks to our support team, Lindsay Brightman, Jillian Sky Jacobs, and Lori Field Okipinti.